All right, welcome back. This is Unit 3, Video 3, and today we're talking all about Egypt. So, Egypt is definitely one of my top countries I want to visit just because they have such a rich history and cool, unique sites, and it also correlates with some of the events of the Bible. So let's get started. First, let's start with geography of Egypt. Egypt is a desert land. Had it not been for the dry climate, the remains of Egypt, the monuments, the documents, and even the bodies of its rulers would have crumbled over a decade ago. Because so much has been preserved from this ancient civilization, we can learn a great deal about its fascinating history and culture. And that's actually why Egyptian ancient civilization is one of the ones we know the most about, is because of this unique geography and climate that allowed for the majority of their remnants to be preserved. That didn't happen in a lot of other societies. If you think about the ancient cultures in South America, I mean, it's really humid. Other than the things that were made out of stone, we don't know much because of that humidity. So this is a cool aspect of Egypt. That's dry climate has made it one of the most well-known ancient cultures. So ancient Egypt was not the square-shaped territory that we call Egypt today. It was the narrow strip of land along the banks of the Nile River. It was about 750 miles long, but in many places less than 12 miles wide. Because the Nile flows northward from the southern plateau, the southern region is called Upper Egypt, and the northern region is actually called Lower Egypt, right? And that's because the Nile flows northward from the South Plateau. It's a little unique like that. And these were Upper Egypt and Lower Egypt. These were two really entirely different lands. Upper Egypt lay close against the Nile, completely cut off from the outside world by desert to the east and west, and by rapids, sometimes called cataracts, to the south. Lower Egypt, on the other hand, spread out across the Nile Delta in easy contact with other nations by way of the Mediterranean Sea and the Sinai Peninsula. And so one Greek historian called Egypt the gift of the river. He was right. If there were no Nile, there would have been no Egypt, because there was almost no rain there. Only the Nile held back the menacing desert wasteland. The river rose and fell every year as the snow at the river's source in the mountains melted every spring, and the river flooded its banks from June through August. This flooding actually deposits tons of rich silt, or good rich soil, on Egypt. Silt is SILT, and it annually provides them with fertile soil for their crops. The Nile is also an important highway. Boats at the northern end of the river, called the Delta, and it's called the Delta after the triangular Greek letter that looks like that a delta. Um, so boats at the northern end of the river could hoist sails and let the wind from the north push them upriver. To return, they needed simply to drop their sails and let the current carry them back. Since nearly all ancient Egyptians lived on the banks of the river, it was easy for those living at one end of the kingdom to communicate with those on the other end. Thus, the Nile greatly contributed to the unified Egypt that we remember. So, the people of Egypt were descended from Mizraim, the son of Noah's son Ham. So, Noah's grandson. Um, In fact, the Hebrews call Egypt Mizraim. But around 3000 BC, a man named Menes is believed to have united the two lands of Upper and Lower Egypt, ruling them from a capital that's called White Walls, aka Memphis. And we're not talking about Tennessee, but that is where Memphis, Tennessee gets its name, is from Memphis, Egypt. Historians refer to this early time as the early dynastic period. And I need to adjust the notes a little. They're a little bit false here. So it says Egyptians are descended from Noah's grandson, which is true, but I put the wrong name. Menes was not the grandson. Mizraim was the grandson. So that's Mizraim. Mizraim was Noah's grandson, Ham's son. Menes was just the ruler of this ancient Egyptian history. The history in this area, remember, is called the early dynastic period. So, from the early dynastic period, we then move on to the three major phases of ancient Egyptian history: the Old Kingdom, the Middle Kingdom, and the New Kingdom. So let's start with the Old Kingdom. Many historians divide ancient Egyptian history into three major phases that we just saw. And these phases are separated by times of unrest, generally known as intermediate periods. So the Old Kingdom was from 2700 to 2200 BC and has been called the Age of the Pharaohs. The Age of the Pharaohs. Um, there were pharaohs or rulers throughout all of ancient Egyptian history, of course, but in the Old Kingdom, they were especially powerful. The people considered them to be gods in human form, and as gods, they owned all of Egypt and used it for their own purposes. So, not generally for the people, or not necessarily benevolent rulers. And it was during this time that the Great Pyramids were built, huge tombs attesting to the splendor and the might of these pharaohs. The most famous of all of these pharaohs in the Old Kingdom was Khufu, or sometimes you see his name as Cheops. So Khufu or Cheops is the same dude. He built the Great Pyramid at Giza, and its construction required thousands of men working for 20 years. Man. So let's go over like some pyramid facts because it's probably the number one thing we know about Egypt as kids growing up is the Great Pyramid of Khufu at Giza. It's a marvelous example of Egyptian architectural skills. It sits virtually aside the 30th parallel on longitude and latitude. It's like literally almost exactly one third of the way from the equator to the North Pole. All four sides of the pyramid face the points of a compass, north, south, east, and west, and it rises to a height of 481 feet. And at its base, each side spans the length of nearly 2.5 football fields. It covers approximately 13 acres, and amazingly, its foundation is almost perfectly flat from side to side. Its level varies less than an inch from one corner to another, over 1,000 feet away. In its construction, the Egyptians used over 2 million stone blocks, the average weight of each stone being 2.5 tons. And these mammoth blocks were so well placed that between some of them, it is impossible to insert the blade of a knife. So while the white limestone that graced its exterior is long gone, it's been stripped away. It was used in other building projects and then stolen in some cases. The Great Pyramid remains still a monument to the genius of ancient Egyptian architects. So, just in case you weren't sure, I said like it's 13 acres. It covers 13 acres. This is like how big an acre is visually, like where that house is in the picture. That's 1 acre. So in this picture, you see 9 acres. You add a couple more, and you get 13 acres. It was huge. So really, the Great Pyramids of at Giza and Khufu are your main things from the Old Kingdom that you need to know. We're going to move on to the Middle Kingdom. So, after a time of rebellion called the First Intermediate Period, the Middle Kingdom, also known as the Age of the People, began. This is from 2040 to 1650 BC. Aware of the social unrest that preceded them, the Egyptian pharaohs of this period directed their attention to projects that would benefit the country as a whole versus just themselves. And as a result, the Middle Kingdom was characterized by peace and construction. So, for example, the Egyptians built irrigation canals and systems of ponds to store the Nile's water for use during the dry season. And that benefited all the farmers and everybody. And it was during this time of peace that the Israelites moved to Egypt. So this is when we see Genesis 46 through 50. God used the influence of Joseph. Now remember, Joseph is Abraham's great grandson to save the Egyptians from starvation and to provide a haven for the children of Israel during a time of famine. Genesis 47. The Israelites stayed in the land of Egypt for 430 years, from 1876 to 1446. We get those times, that time frame in Exodus 12. And during that time, their numbers grew from 70 to over 2 million. And after the Middle Kingdom, in what has been called the Second Intermediate Period, a foreign people called the Hyksos came into the land and eventually became its rulers. And it's not known exactly who they were or how they became so powerful. Many believe that the Egyptians learned the art of war from the Hyksos. Evidently, the Hyksos brought with them horses, chariots, and bronze weapons. And so they might have been responsible for the beginning of the enslavement of the Hebrews. So, Middle Kingdom Israelites. There's a connection there. Now we're going to go to the New Kingdom. Egypt eventually got rid of the Hyksos. They expelled them and restored Egyptians to the throne. This new kingdom, from 1570 to 1075 BC, is also called the Age of the Empire, because it was in this age that Egypt became a great power in the Near East. Because it was in this age that Egypt had pharaohs that kind of became warrior kings. These warrior kings extended their control to Palestine, Syria, and the lands of the Nile to the south. So in this age, Upper Egypt became more important, and as a result, Thebes became the Egyptian capital. Several pharaohs in this age are of particular interest to us. An early ruler of this new kingdom was Hatshepsut, one of the rare female rulers of Egypt. We don't know for sure, but she may have been the daughter of Pharaoh who discovered Moses in the bulrushes and raised him as her own son. This could have been Moses' adopted mom. Exodus 2, 5 through 10 is where that theory comes from. Her rule was peaceful, and during her reign, Egypt traded extensively with other nations. Hatshepsut's reign was followed by that of Thutmose III, regarded as the greatest of all the Egyptian warrior kings. And under Thutmose, the Egyptian armies conquered Palestine and Syria and extended the Egyptian rule all the way to the Euphrates River. One modern historian called Thutmose the Napoleon of Egypt. Moses, another great leader, lived at this same time. If current Egyptology is correct, Thutmose III was the pharaoh who refused to allow the children of Israel to go. He finally yielded after God sent 10 plagues upon the land of Egypt. We see this in Exodus 7 through 11 or 7 through 12. However, Pharaoh changed his mind and pursued the Hebrew people. God overwhelmed Pharaoh's chariots and horsemen by returning the waters of the Red Sea upon them in Exodus 14. And about a century and a half after the Hebrews left Egypt, Ramses II came to power. During his long reign, Egypt once again built mammoth temples and monuments. Egypt gradually declined from its rank as a Near Eastern power after Ramses' death. He was the last great pharaoh. Um, and if you guys remember that poem that we read about Ozymandias and the big statue with the fallen head off to the side, he, Sir Percy Shelley, was inspired by a statue of Ramses II when he wrote that poem. So we need to look a little bit at the culture of Egypt, and I want you to add this to your notes. So Egyptian social culture was shaped like a pyramid. At the top was the pharaoh, supremely powerful. Below him were the priests and nobles, or the government officials. Then came the merchants, the common people, and the foreign slaves, in that order. Most Egyptians were poor, but anyone from a lower class, even a foreign slave, could rise to a higher class if he gained the pharaoh's favor. And that was a rarity that you had any, like this is a minor chance, but the fact that you had any chance at all to rise in social class was pretty amazing with the Egyptian society. So this scenario was also illustrated with Joseph. He was a Hebrew slave who became the second most powerful man in Egypt. And unlike women in other ancient cultures, Egyptian women were especially favored in their society. So, for example, women could own property and operate a business. They could also occupy religious positions as priestesses. As we have seen, one woman even became a great pharaoh. The legacy left by the Egyptian civilization is truly great. The Egyptians made important advances in the field of medicine. They increased the knowledge of anatomy and prescribed drugs as remedies for diseases. They also developed the solar calendar, dividing the year into 365 days, which we still use today. And they used a form of picture writing called hieroglyphics and developed a type of paper made from reeds of the papyrus plant. They drew upon their understanding of geometry and astronomy to build the pyramids, some of the most amazing architectural achievements of the ancient world. The Egyptian religion was polytheistic, and the people considered the pharaohs to be gods, but there were many other gods as well. They had animal gods, natural forces gods, and even the Nile itself. The most important gods were Amun and Ra, who later became one god, Amun Ra, the sun god, and Osiris and Isis, the husband and wife who ruled the underworld. The Egyptians believed that after death they would be judged according to their works. Their heart is what they were referring to. And in the afterlife, their heart was placed on a set of scales and weighed against the feather of Mat, the goddess of truth and justice. Egyptians believed that the heart was made heavy by wicked deeds, but if a person's heart was lighter than Mat's feather, he would spend the afterlife in a place of peace, fishing, hunting, and relaxing. The pharaoh's tombs and those of other important men were filled with objects for them to enjoy in the next world. However, the Egyptians believed that these pleasures could not be enjoyed unless the body was preserved. Thus, they developed the practice of embalming and preserving corpses. Today, mummies of the Egyptians lie in museums preserved by the embalmers' skills of centuries of desert dryness. The greatness of ancient Egypt is no more. After the New Kingdom, Egypt fell successfully to the Assyrians, the Persians, the Greeks, the Romans. God judged the Egyptians for their worship of false gods, as well as for their pride, a vice that has often kept people and nations from repenting and trusting the true God. If we look at Ezekiel 29:3, it says, "Thus says the Lord God, Behold, I am against thee, Pharaoh, king of Egypt, which hath said, My river is mine own, and I have made it for myself." Such arrogance ultimately leads to divine humiliation. Egypt shall be the basest of the kingdoms, neither shall it exalt itself any more above the nations, in verse 15. But in God's judgment, he does not forget his mercy. The Bible also speaks of a coming day of blessing for Egypt in Isaiah 19:22. So, we are going to be doing some projects here in a bit that deal with Egypt, and getting a little bit of a closer look into their culture and some of the unique facets of it. I hope this was helpful. Please let me know if you have any questions about this particular lesson. Have a great day, guys. I'll see you later.